Okay, let's just pretend I didn't forget to do that. So let's start from the beginning. There's always, it seems, a great deal of conjecture about in the field of archaeology, particularly when it comes to things that sort of are important in the relationship between humans and horses. So arguments over events that happened almost 6,000 years ago are common, and they haven't really been resolved. So one of the big points of debate that surrounded the early domestication of the horse is, were they originally kept for meat or for riding? And there's enough evidence to support both sides of that argument, which in itself is enough evidence to suggest our ancient ancestors saw the horses both a good way to get around and a convenient source of food. So the first evidence of bit use in early people occurred several thousand years ago, and this evidence was found in a town called Derivka. In what is now the Ukraine. So scientists found the fossilised skull of a stallion, and with it were two pieces of antler with holes drilled in them. And it didn't take them long to figure out that the pieces of antler would once have been leather, have had leather threaded between them, forming a primitive bit. So that's the first piece of evidence that we have for bit use. So here we have, let's just backtrack a little bit, and we're talking about the origin of the horse. So this is what Hyracotherium looked like 55 million years ago, and that is the earliest ancestor that we know of the horse. And so Hyracotherium was small, about the size of a Labrador, and he lived in the forest because 55 million years ago, that's what the world looked like. It was all forests, and he ate fruit and leaves. And he had a lot more teeth than the modern horse does. And in fact, we have, in today's modern horse, we see wolf teeth, which are small peg-like teeth. Let me just take the head off my skull. And we see these little wolf teeth here. Excuse me. Okay, where is she? There she is. See these? These are what we call vestigial teeth, because they are what is left of the extra teeth that Hyracotherium had, because he had to digest leaves and bark and stuff. So he needed to be able to chew a lot better. Little wolf teeth, they're little peg-like things there. So you'll just have to forgive me coming and going and disappearing as I get stuff. So Hyracotherium lived 55 million years ago, and then 20 million years ago, something new appeared on the earth, and that was grass. And Hyracotherium was not particularly well adapted for grasslands because he was too slow and too small. And you can see he's nicely camouflaged. And of course, once grasslands came, then the horse had to evolve to exploit them or become extinct. And that they did. They did that beautifully. And therefore, the horse got much bigger and much faster and much more vigilant. So what we see today, the modern horse, is a lot of what his adaptations are to do with the change that happened in the grass and forest about 20 million years ago. And so horses have what we call hypsodont teeth, which means that they continue to grow throughout his whole life. And they do this because when you are a grazer, you inevitably pick up sand when you're eating, and therefore your teeth wear down. So you need teeth that continually can keep erupting from the gums throughout your whole life in order to manage that. And there are lots of other things that the horse has that help him, that part of his evolution, and particularly it happened 20 million years ago when he got grass, because the digestion of the fibres in grass is particularly difficult. And that's why people say that humans have an appendix that's for digesting the cellulose, which is one of the main components of grass. So the horse has a cecum, which is basically like a big vat where sort of bacterial activity and microbial activity goes on and helps his digestion. And as we've talked about in our previous lectures, it was this evolution of the cecum that really pre-adapted the horse in a way for domestication, because the cecum allows the horse to eat and run, whereas sheep and cows have to lie down and chew their cud. So you couldn't ride into battle on a ruminant, because they would have to lie down all the time to continue to digest their food appropriately. So therefore, all these little adaptations that occurred from between Hyracotherium and Equus caballus, which is our horse that we have now, allowed him to fit into his environmental niche very well. And so you'll see in the modern horse that he gets the height and in the fastest way possible, and I mean that gives him the most speed, and that is because he develops a lot of length in his limb below the knee. So length above the knee is also useful, but below the knee is where you particularly get the strength from, the speed from. And so we see, for the difference between Hyracotherium and Equus caballus, Hyracotherium has 3 toes on the front legs, on his front feet. And in the modern horse, as we know, those 3 toes have now become the horse walking on the tip of his middle finger. And the 2 toes either side, the 1 toe on each side, has become the horse's splint bones. His chestnuts and his ergot have become what happened to basically his toenails. So sometimes you will see those referred to as vestigial splint bones, because, like wolf teeth, they are vestiges of the horse's previous era evolution. So that's something really important to know. So horses have been domesticated for about 6,000 years. And as I said earlier, the first evidence for domestication occurred in this place in the Ukraine called Derivka. And what they found there was the head of a horse and a skull of a horse and these bits of bored out antler, which they eventually realised would have worked as a bit if they had a piece of either wood or leather strung between them. And here we can see the remains of a mummified horse skull in Mongolia, which is the microscopic wear patterns on the upper premolars are evidence of bit use. So this is really important. Excuse me, grab my head, or half my head. The microscopic wear patterns on the leading premolar of the skull's teeth is a wear pattern that we only ever see in horses that have been ridden with or that have had a bit in their mouth. And so it's I'm pointing at the skull and you can't see it. So it's the leading premolars. Obviously, this is how she goes, this way. Her name is Kate, by the way, because she's skinny like Kate Moss. Oh, that's her brain falling out. Don't worry about that. There you go, her brain fell out. Sorry, Kate. So this leading premolar here, that's the wolf tooth here, premolar. That in horses that have been ridden with a bit in their mouth, that premolar has microscopic cracks on its leading edge, and the edge is ever so slightly beveled. Now, that's really interesting, because you might say, yeah, but modern horses get ridden with metal bits, and therefore that would, abrade the teeth, whereas these horses of this era were ridden with leather or wooden bits. And that is very true. But I have to say to you that they have discovered that even if you ride horses in leather bits, they will still do that microscopic beveling on the leading premolar, for the simple reason that horses with a bit in their mouth will usually clamp their teeth together, and because they graze and therefore they pick up bits of sand, that actually is what does the damage. And the horse's jaws are enormously strong, so easy to do that little bit of damage. So to placate the skeptics, a group of archaeologists x-ray the teeth of a previously unbroken group of horses, and before and after several months of training in a bit made of leather or antler, or wood, exactly as they had been. And sure enough, the horses in the study showed the same wear pattern as the Derivka stallion. And that's extraordinary, because it places the riding of the horse 500 years before the invention of the wheel. So you can see really why horse riding is so embedded in our culture. Really, we've been doing it for longer than we've been doing just about anything, which means that I think it's kind of quite easy for us to say that horse training is probably the oldest profession, unlike as other people would have you believe that it's prostitution. I don't think so at all. I think, well, and then some people would say, what's the difference? Well, I can't answer that, even though this is an adult learning environment. Anyway, so this is particularly fascinating, I digress, because it means that humans invented bits over 500 years before they invented the wheel, and over 3,000 years before they started making iron. So there are other bits of evidence that suggest humans are riding horses several thousand years ago too. So in a town called Botai, funnily enough, in Kazakhstan, scientists found really large stones that were quarried from a quarry over 50 miles away from the site. So although they were obviously very sturdy people from fossil evidence, the Botai people, it doesn't suggest they were particularly amazingly strong. So it doesn't seem logical to suggest that that they would have carried these huge stones 50 miles. So it seems probably quite likely that in the early days horses were used to transport goods as well as humans. And the other piece of evidence that points to horses as riding animals theory is that some of the Botai burial sites contain the full skeleton of a horse. And so it's really wouldn't suggest that you would get people who would be able to drag the whole skeleton of a horse to their town. Just come with me for a minute while I take my dogs outside because they are being annoying. Okay, sorry. Bye-bye, dogs. Oh, shit, dropping my laptop. Okay, so back we go. Pardon me for that small digression. Oh, and we've changed the slide so many times. So here we go. So yes, you would not kill a horse on the plains and then drag it all the way back to your house to bury with your dead king. You would have a tame one that you would kill and drag into the grave from there. So even though the early horses were probably only 14 hands, they still could have weighed really close to the 500 kilograms. So far too heavy to be hunted on the plain and then, dragged kilometres to a burial site. There are two other factors to consider that confirm the belief that early horses were domesticated for other than eating, and one of these is the age of the skeletons found around the site. In wild populations, death occurs mostly among the very old and the very young, whereas in populations kept for meat, most deaths are amongst those animals of prime eating age and mostly males. The Botai horses seem to die in a more natural pattern with a fairly even distribution across all ages. And finally, one of the things that I think is really funny is that one of the best pieces of evidence we've got to suggest that the Botai people rode horses is all the leather working tools that they left. There are just so many of them, which I think is really funny because I can imagine that if you were trying to tame wild horses and you had no idea of how to tame wild horses, that you would probably break a lot of gear and therefore need a lot of leather working tools to continue doing that. But regardless of how it happened or why, the horse was domesticated, and that probably more than any other event in the history of our species forever changed the world around us. It's simply inconceivable to imagine history without the horse. The horse was the first labour-saving device, and as soon as humans could ride, they became more efficient hunters. That increased efficiency gave them more leisure time, which in turn allowed them to explore non-essential tasks like art and music. So the horse opened up lands that have been out of the reach of ancient people and allowed them to travel long distances easily and populate far corners of the world. And more importantly, you can't manage large numbers of livestock on foot. You need a horse or nowadays a motorbike or a helicopter. But back in those days, it actually allowed them to practice agriculture, the horses humans to practice agriculture, because they were able to manage the horses, the tame horses from the back of, they were able to manage herds of livestock from the back of horses. So the world changes and technological advances in the early 20th century meant that the horse became less and less useful to humanity. Tractors and trains superseded the horse in transport and agriculture, and suddenly the horse was at a crossroads between usefulness and redundancy. But in an ironic twist, the technological advances that could have made life very difficult for the horse actually meant that it saved him, because suddenly, with all the labour-saving devices in the middle of the 20th century, human beings had leisure and lots of leisure time. And so, you know, there's the horse standing around, becoming fairly redundant after the Second World War, twiddling his thumbs, what am I going to do? All this leisure time. And he slotted very neatly into that leisure time gap in human society. And it's sort of a plot twist, I reckon, that seems both, you know, convenient and yet strangely unsurprising. The horse became one of our favourite ways to waste time and money, incidentally, for those of you that, you know, don't have horses and understand how much they cost. And it sort of was a renaissance of sorts for the horse. And I suppose it's unsurprising, because after 6,000 years of shared existence, it seems unlikely that we would have given the horse up just because we didn't have any use for him anymore. So today, when very few people need horses, they're more numerous, more expensive, more varied, more studied, more managed, and more looked after than ever before. So I think that's well played, horse. So let's continue. Oh yes, so lots of animals were, you know, we attempted to domesticate lots and lots of animal species over the years, and moose was one of them, and it wasn't successful. And I don't know if a moose is a ruminant or not, possibly. But they're big, so you wouldn't have wanted to ride a moose. I think you'd much rather, and he has antlers too, or horns, I'm not sure. So when we talk about bits, we discovered that there are lots of different designs. In fact, there are more designs for bits than just about any other piece of horse riding equipment. And when you understand how negative reinforcement and habituation work, which we're going to talk about, you will see very clearly that why it is that so many different kinds of bits exist. And that's because when each different bit type that we have works on a different part of the horse's mouth. And when pressure is unrelenting, or the horse cannot find a solution to remove that pressure, then he will habituate to it. And therefore we see in horse training an escalation of bit pressure, where we start, you know, the young horses are almost always started with a snaffle, and then they go to a slightly stronger bit, and then a stronger bit, and then a stronger bit, stronger. And it's just because they go to different types of places on the horse's mouth. But we'll talk about that in more detail. So nose rings are generally not an effective way to control the horse due to the existence of the interdental space. We've tried lots of different things. So if I just bear with me. So here's my Kate again. Oh, Lord, she's heavy. She is, and that's her jaw opening there. So this little piece of this here is called the interdental space. And when a horse is bitted directly, the bit sits in the interdental space. Okay, like that. So that's how the bit actually works. So yes, we don't use nose rings on horses because they have this lovely interdental space, which is another reason really why the horse index was pre-adapted for life in domestication. So let's just remember this bit, because we have to know this bit. The 4 quadrants of operant conditioning, just quickly and briefly go over them again. Positive reinforcement, adding something reinforcing that the horse wants makes the behaviour more likely to happen again. Negative reinforcement, taking away something that the horse doesn't like, makes the behaviour more likely to happen again. Positive punishment, adding something the horse doesn't like, makes the behaviour less likely to occur in the future. And negative punishment, taking away something that the horse likes, makes the behaviour less likely to occur in the future. Both kinds of punishment reduce behaviour, both kinds of reinforcement increase it. Both kinds of positive add something, and both kinds of negative take it away. So negative reinforcement is the way that the bit works, okay, because it's pressure in the horse's mouth that is aversive. It doesn't have to be terribly aversive, it can just be mildly annoying. Pressure in the horse's mouth that's aversive, that is removed when he offers the correct response. So remove a mildly aversive pressure after a behaviour makes the behaviour more likely in the future. That is taking away a mildly annoying pressure, like the pressure of your leg or the pressure of the bit, when the horse, or so let's say the pressure of your leg when the horse goes forward, makes it more likely that he'll go forward again. Negative reinforcement is always in 3 phases. That's the light signal, which is like saying please, the stronger signal, which is what the light signal turns into, which is a bit like saying do it, and the release of the signal, which is a bit like saying thank you. It's a bit that's the bit that identifies the bit that was correct. So there's no gap between the light signal and the heavy signal. And the release of the pressure is the most important of those 3 because it's the pressure that trains the horse. It's not the pressure that trains the horse, it's the removal of pressure that trains the horse. So we need to understand 2 learning modalities really clearly. 2 learning modalities really clearly. 1 is negative reinforcement, 2 is habituation. So habituation is just a fancy way of saying get used to something. Some things are hard to habituate to, things that are too close, too loud, appear suddenly or move erratically or are hard to get used to. So we have 6 different ways of desensitising the horse to things. 1, let's talk about clippers. Systematic desensitisation, turn the clippers on while the horse is in the stable. 2, counter conditioning. Turn the clippers on, then give the horse a treat. The horse will quickly associate the clippers with treats. 3, overshadowing. This is the most effective way. We'll see that next slide. Approach conditioning, make the horse chase what's frightening. Stimulus blending, using a known stimuli to introduce a novel cue. And response prevention, preventing the flight response, assist with rapid habituation. So the most important thing to remember about habituation is it must be done gradually and progressively. When it's done all at once, it's called flooding and can make the horse even more scared of the object than before. So overshadowing is when you apply 2 things at the same time. So the scientific sort of definition of that is when 2 stimuli are applied concurrently, only the most salient will elicit a response, which means that basically if I yell at you to sit up, just stand up and sit down, the one I yell the loudest is the one that you're going to do. The other command or cue you're probably going to habituate to. So when we have horses, you know, ridden in these very tight bits that you can see, or very harsh bits that you can see, and they're both in double bridles, which means 2 bits in the horse's mouth. And that is particularly quite harsh. So just as an example, that's what that would look like. So in a double bridle, we have 2 bits in the horse's mouth, so you can see there's a lot of shit going on in there. And therefore, you'll see if you scroll back out, you would actually see that those horses have been ridden with spurs as well. And when we understand that of all the ungulate species, the horse has the most sensitive lips and tongue because he's a discriminatory grazer and he can't vomit. So therefore, he needs to be able to really pick through the grass that he's eating to make sure he's not eating poisonous stuff. So therefore, it's really important that he can identify things, and also because he can't see what he's eating, because his face, like, he looks down the plane of his own face. So when he sees, he can't sort of see past this line here. Okay, oh, come on, Kate, don't be naughty. Down you go. Good girl. Okay, so let's look. Holy moly, there's a lot of stuff going on today. So different bits act on different parts of the horse's head. So these are the different parts that they can act on: the poll, the palate, the nose, the upper bars, the tongue, the corners of the lips, the lower bars, and the curb or chin groove. And the chin groove is basically this bit under here, and the bars are the hard yet covered in flesh, both upper and lower surface of the interdental space. So palates, obviously you've got a palate, so you know what that is, and the poll is the joint that basically joins the horse's head to his neck. So different kind of bit. the snaffle. Okay, this is basically a snaffle. Ancient bits were all snaffles, very wide and often extremely thin, but essentially the single jointed snaffle design hasn't changed much in 3,000 years, which is when it started to be made out of metal. Over the years, they've been refined a bit by adding an extra joint, and now you can spend hundreds of dollars buying a snaffle bit if you need to. And essentially, the snaffle bit works on the bars of the horse's mouth, the corners of the lips, and also, to a certain extent, the tongue. So we have not a particular, I mean, it can be very harsh. It can be made to be very harsh, but generally speaking, this is also a snaffle because there's no leverage. Okay, that's what we mean by a snaffle, a bit with no leverage, and I'll explain a bit more about that. So the bit works on the bars, the corners, and the tongue. And when these parts of the horse's mouth become habituated to pressure, will often turn to the curb family of bits. These bits usually have a chain and a longer shank, so there's a degree of leverage involved in their use. Curb bits work on the chin groove, the bars, and the pole. So you can see that if you've actually habituated the horse to the pressure in his mouth that the snaffle applies, if you go to a curb bit, suddenly you've got some new space that he hasn't habituated to, which is why in the beginning, when people change to these bits, they go, oh my God, it's so effective. It's amazing. However, if training is incorrect, the next level is the gag bit. Now, where am I? This is my gag. Oh, here we go. Hang on. Oh, okay, sorry. Go back. I've got my gag there. We'll be back to that in a minute. So this is a complicated way of demonstrating that a thinner bit exerts more pressure on the horse's mouth than a thicker bit, given the same amount of force on the reins. So if we have a look at this bit, it's actually going to exert less pressure on the horse's mouth, more pressure on the horse's mouth than this thicker bit, because pressure equals force over area. Now, if you were in class today, I would fill up these, I have filled these water bottles up, and we have these bits attached to them. You would put the bits on your arm like this to feel the difference between a thick bit and a thin bit. And you can actually feel when these water bottles are full, because that's in a kilo of weight, because they're a litre, that this big thick rubber snaffle doesn't exert nearly as much pressure on your arm as this really tiny thin, well, this is a stallion bit, also known as a chiffney. So that's one of the things that we do. Woo. Everything's falling over, it's fantastic. So these fatter bits are going to exert less force or less pressure than a thin bit like this. Having said that, you can still do damage with a fat bit, and some horses don't like fat bits because they don't fit in their mouths. Whew. Okay, so now we have the curb bit. Curb bit has got, usually there's leverage involved, so the bridle attaches and the reins attach here, and then you've got a curb chain, which actually means that the pressure is, it becomes like a lever. Okay, so you're going to put the bit like this on your hand, and this is what you would have done if you'd been in my class today, and we would apply pressure, and what you'll feel is that it actually applies quite a lot of pressure. And then here we have my little maths. This is my favourite maths thing, which isn't saying anything because I don't know anything about maths, but so it's actually the only maths thing that I know. So M1 is the mass on one end of the fulcrum, which is, let's say, this end. M2, A is the different distance from the fulcrum to M1, so that's A. And then B is the distance from the fulcrum to M2, and the mass on the other end of the fulcrum is the output force. If we double the distance on one side of the lever, it takes half of the mass to balance it out. That is, if on the curb bit, the shank below the mouthpiece is 2 times longer than that above the mouthpiece, the pressure exerted on the tongue and the curb chain is twice that which the rider applies with the reins. This is not an exact science, but it does give you a bit of an idea of the forces at work in the horse's mouth, because it's not a simple lever because of the curb chain. All right, but it does, let's say for the point of the argument that it does. So if we have a look at this bit here, which is a very common bit would be used in dressage, this bit here is twice as long as this bit here. So that's the fulcrum, because that's the pivot point. That bit is twice as long as that bit. So if we double the distance on one side of the lever, it takes half of the mass to balance it out. So you can move twice as much as you thought you could with that pressure. So when you use anything with a curb, you are exponentially increasing the pressure in the horse's mouth. So double bridle, again, is this. 2 bits in the horse's mouth. So now we have a curb and a snaffle. So now we've got all of the parts of the horse's mouth being used. The chin groove, the bars, the pole, the tongue, the corners of the mouth, and the palate if the bit has a port. Now, a port is this bit in the middle here, and you can get them that are quite high. So it's possible to exert an enormous amount of pressure with a double bridle. The next one to go to, if that doesn't work, is what we call a gag bit. Now, I've lost my gag. Oh, here she is. This is a really interesting piece of equipment because, oh my God, so tangled. Oh, hello. Okay, so in the gag bit, there you go. It actually works like a pulley. So the more you pull on the reins, the higher the bit goes up in the horse's mouth. So gag bits work on the lips, the pole, the palate, the tongue, and the corners of the mouth. If you had a head check or a running martingale and a tight noseband, you've got a bit that acts on pretty much all the parts of the horse's mouth. Not as effectively as the double bridle, because it gets every single piece. But you've got a bit of a chance if you've habituated them to that. Yes, Natasha, both the bits are placed above the tongue. They just sit together like a normal bit. So that is basically why we see this escalation in pressure when horses are ridden with no understanding of how learning theory works. And in reality, most horses should be able to be controlled with just a simple snaffle or even a bitless bridle. So a bitless bridle is a bridle where there is no bit. And they're actually illegal in FEI competition for some crazy reason, because they don't think they've ever been associated with more accidents. And in fact, a lot of horses, it's a little bit like in horses, because most accidents that occur in horses occur because of the flight response. The flight response is made infinitely worse by fear, and fear is made worse by pain. Therefore, removing sources of pain and discomfort for the horse is often really useful in diminishing flight response behaviours. And therefore, sometimes when we have horses that are extremely traumatised by previous training, we can use a bitless bridle, and that really helps them get over that. It's a little bit like most aggression in dogs is caused by fear. So beating a dog for being aggressive is actually just compounding the problem. So it doesn't make any sense, but then lots of things don't make sense in life, and that's a bit from the old days. Yeah, not particularly nice. Okay, so here's a picture of the horse's skull showing all the places where these are the blood vessels. So you can see that the horse's face is very rich in blood supply. And here he is, that's all the nerves that happen in the horse's face. So you can see how unbelievably complex all those nerves are, and why the horse's face is so incredibly sensitive to pressures of different kinds. And then if we put a noseband on, we can really, you know, stuff things up with the horse. But we should, when we have a noseband, we should really not have the noseband done up too tightly. And for a long time in FEI competition, there was a rule that you had to have 2 fingers like that between the noseband and the bridle on the horse's face. But because nobody could agree on how big fingers were, they took that out of the FEI rules. And so now the International Society for Equitation Science has proposed that all FEI competitions have access to these. And this is what we call a noseband taper gauge. And so basically, let me get Kate and I will show you how this works. Now, here she is with her noseband on, and we should be able to do this with the noseband tightness. Okay, so that's being able to place the taper gauge between the nasal bone and the noseband. So that's what the taper gauge is for. And that would basically take the guesswork out of getting nosebands, you know, not too tight or whatever. That's 2 fingers. So the horse's head is a really complex interlocking web of nerves, muscles and bones, and there are about 26 bones in the horse's head. It's like a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle designed to feel and absorb impact. Like the rest of the horse's skeleton, the bones in the skull are not fully mature until the horse is 6 or 7 years old. So people use nosebands for a variety of reasons. To stop the horse from opening its mouth, to stop it from evading bit pressure, and to make the pressure of the bit more effective or more aversive. Some people use them because they look nice, and others because it's compulsory to use them in their chosen discipline, which is ridiculous. So there was an Irish researcher and vet called Orla Doty, and she tested the nosebands of 750 horses at a competition. And remember that the FEI used to have a rule that the gear check steward should be able to fit the 2 fingers on the noseband. So they just, because they couldn't decide on how big fingers were, they just said, oh, that's too hard, let's just get rid of that completely. Orla discovered that only 44% of the horses tested was the noseband adjusted so that she could fit 1 finger between the noseband and the horse, let alone 2. And there was only 7% of horses tested could she fit 2 fingers in the correct way. I'm, you know, no mathematician, as I've said, but this suggests that the significant percentage of horses tested had their nosebands done up way too tight. Now, if we think about it, pressure, in medicine, pressure is measured in millimetres of mercury. And a tourniquet, which is around 100 millimetres of mercury, can cause permanent nerve damage to the way nerves conduct electrical impulses and impaired muscle function. Most people, when tested, can't stand, because it's too painful, pressure of about 250 millimetres of mercury. Yet all have found that over 40% of nosebands were somewhere between 200 and 400 millimetres of mercury. That's easily tight enough to cause permanent damage to the sensitive structures of the horse's head. But here's the most frightening thing. Because of the forces at work on the horse's body during jumping and fast work, the pressures of the noseband are amplified. So when the horse jumps or turns sharply or bucks, all have found that in the pressure of a tight noseband can actually peak at 1,400 millimetres of mercury. That's just so much, too much pressure for the horses to cope with. Another researcher who studied the effect of nosebands in horses is Professor Paul McGee, a vet and a lecturer and a winner of the Eureka Prize, Science Prize. And Paul and his team studied horses before and after they had tight nosebands applied and found that all of them exhibited well-known signs of stress, which was an increase in eye temperature, a decrease in heart rate variability, and a general increase in heart rate. So the study was small, and because of this, it caused enormous controversy. But it's just, you know, just because it's small doesn't mean that we should let bureaucracy stand in the way of good welfare, because it's a warning sign that many of the practices we take for granted are indeed detrimental to the horse's welfare. Now, I've got a noseband here. When we look at this, okay, so here we have more nosebands. So when we look at this, this is the equine pain face. So this study was done in, I think, 2014, and it shows the common physical expressions that the horses in pain have. And so we have their lowered ears, so the distance between the ears increases at the base, a contraction of the muscle above the eye, so it's sort of peaky little triangle thing, a tense stare, nostrils dilated in the mediolateral direction, so that means from the midline to the outside, an edged shape to the muzzle, so the lips are pressed together and flattened chin, and tension of the facial muscles. Now, interestingly enough, because of what we've just been discussing, when they did this pain face, they used two different kinds of pain on the horse. One was capsaicin, which is a very burny cream, essentially. It's like a chili, sort of like chili, but like it's chili on steroids, that you can use to stimulate the nerves in the skin, but it's an irritant. And the other was that they used a tourniquet on the horse's forearm, and they used a tourniquet at 240 millimeters of mercury. So that is nowhere, they got the horses to exhibit pain face, to show the symptoms of pain when the tourniquet was on their arm or on their forearm, not even on their face, which has obviously got a lot more nerves in it. So it is interesting that we accept that horses can wear these tight nosebands when having something less tight than a lot of nosebands, and even not on a sensitive part of their body, actually is enough to make them make this pain face. So if we have a look here at this horse wearing a very tight noseband, you can see absolutely classic symptoms of pain here and with the midline here. And I mean, look how much that is cutting into the soft tissues of the face. Yeah, it's gross, isn't it, Natasha? So yeah, really distressing to see those sorts of things. And yet I bet you that's sort of like that's probably a member of the royal family, or this would be some sort of picture in a horse magazine. And the magazine would not be saying, oh, isn't this terrible, look how tight his noseband is. Now, this is what we call a crank noseband, and I have one here. And so when you have a crank noseband, yeah, it's awful, isn't it, Paloma, to eyes? And once you know about the pain face, when you see this here, it's very telling. So here we have a crank noseband. Now, for some reason, just buckling it isn't enough. In modern dressage and show jumping, we often have these, which means that you thread this bit through here and pull it tight here. Okay, and then therefore what you've actually got is a two-pulley system, because the buckle itself is a pulley and that becomes a pulley. Okay, and when you have a two-pulley system, you are actually doubling the amount of pressure of force applied. So this is one of the most common nosebands that you can buy today, and it's, yeah, as I said before, it's what engineers would call a two-pulley system, because there are 2 points around which the leather slides. A single pulley, such as is at work in a not crank noseband, makes no difference to the amount of force that you can apply. It just changes the direction of the force. But a two-pulley system doubles the amount of force applied, and that means with this bit of gear, even a small child could apply a pressure to make that the pressure of that noseband highly aversive. Where's my slide? Oh, that's the taper gauge in use. There. So what I normally do at this point and I'll do it on myself so you can see, and I'll show you, is I get my blood pressure cuff and I put it on you and we take your blood pressure. Oh, no, we don't. We actually just make the pressure such that it's unpleasant for you. So I will put this on myself. My arms are too skinny. And now we're going to do it up so you can see how much pressure I've got on me. Oh, hang on. I can tighten my little thing here. You can see I'm not a nurse, can't you? Okay, so where am I? Oh, see, I'm popping the Velcro. Come on. So have a look at me. I'm pumping it up. It's very tight now. So that is actually now, can you read that? Not high. Okay, let's go to see if I can get, okay, so that's really uncomfortable and very unpleasant. And it is at 220. So, it's actually really horrible. So that is enough pressure to make me I wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything else but the pressure in my arm, and that's only at 240 millimeters of mercury. So it's particularly unpleasant for the horse. And then we can have a look just quickly before we finish up at some other weird things. Now, different bits, how they go in the horse's mouth. So I'll get Kate here and we'll put some bits in. Let me see if I can lift her up. There you go. Now, Kate's going to show you how the bits go in the mouth. So we have all kinds of things. Now, you might think this looks like some kind of torture device. I don't think you're that far wrong, and I can't actually even work out how it goes. Something like this. But we actually bought a horse, and it came with this bridle, or this piece of stuff. Oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing here, because this was apparently the only thing it could be ridden in. So my feeling is it goes like this. And then when you apply the pressure, it pulls on the nose and under here. So you see we've got all kinds of different sort of combinations of curb and snaffle and gag and nose pressure. So I suppose the thing that I should have said in my lecture is that when you run out of places in the mouth to habituate the horse, you can then add some kind of string on the nose band and you can pull on his nose as well. Now, where's this thing? Yeah. Yes, Julia. Now, this is a similar thing. Oh, I can never remember what this is called. Not that it's important, but also, again, we have pressure on the nose. Okay, so when we put this in his mouth and we apply the pressure to the reins, it also pulls on his nose. Now, the first time we put this bit in the skull's mouth and played with it, we actually, because I've never obviously used this on a horse of my own, but we used this on the skull. We actually broke the bone of the skull. And I mean, obviously dead bone is not as strong as live bone, but it gives you a bit of an idea of the sorts of pressure that you can exert with one of these bits. And so here we just have some different bits. Again, that's a curb bit. This is just a rubber snaffle called a mullen mouth. Another one. Here's a snaffle. So it's got a single joint. And the other snaffle I showed you before, I find now, had a double joint. And that's a curb bit. So that's, yeah. So has anybody got any questions? that seems fine. 5 would be fine. Yeah, no, I'm going to, I will get your, let me just let you talk. So, hang on a sec. I'll put this back. I want you to ask me questions here, Celine, but let me let you chat. No, hang on. Aha, hang on. No, I can't find where I'm supposed to let you talk. Julia, can you let everybody? Oh, okay. So Julia's going to let, so you can talk now. So Celine, just ask me questions. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yep, gotcha.
Okay, so about a drop noseband, do they get used to close the horse's mouth, and do they not sit under that that bones and cause damage on the lower part of their nose?
They can do if they're too tight. Hello, Dr. Miller.
Hello, everyone.
They can, but obviously in a live horse, there's flesh covering this over this part of the nose here, so they can't sit under the bone. But the problem, of course, with a drop noseband is that if they are below the point of the bone and you tighten them too much, they compress the nostrils, so the horse can actually breathe less. And when you understand that horses are nose breathers, that becomes, increasingly important. That they wouldn't want that to happen, be able to happen. So horses don't breathe through their mouths; they breathe through their noses. Yeah, and so painful when it goes up to 1400 millimeters of mercury. You can imagine when jumping, or apparently when bucking as well. And so because we understand, all of us here now, a lot about the way in which learning occurs, I think you could see that for some people, having a noseband set to particularly tight would be useful, because I feel like it would actually overshadow some of the horse's environment. So that's possibly why they have become such a part of horse training, because a very tight noseband probably makes the horse focus less on the environment around him and perhaps more on the pressures on his head. So that's my theory about it, but I haven't seen that verified in a scientific paper. Has anyone else got any comments or questions? No, no one's got any comments. Would anybody like to see anything again? Any of the bits? I could show you any of the bits, or the noseband, or anything like that, or put the bits in the horse's mouth. No. Right.
If no one's got any,
Just a moment, Portland.
Sorry.
Yep, go for it, Celine.
In regards to what you said about that with closing for the air, and that, because hackamores, some people say that they close for the air as well, and because they don't put pressure in the mouth, but they do put quite a lot of pressure elsewhere around the horses, and doesn't it?
Yeah. So this is a kind of hackamore, and so those people that don't haven't seen it in action, they go on the horse's nose like this and apply pressure on the nose. In this, like they're just another form of bitless bridle. And if they are located too low down the nose, or they're too tight, they can actually impede the horse's breathing. But if we go back, and also the skin of the horse's face is very sensitive. So my feeling is that you can be really aversive with a hackamore or a bitless bridle. Is not probably quite as aversive as you can be with some bits, but you can be pretty aversive with a bitless bridle too, especially if it's used incorrectly. And you know, in the 80s, now I'm showing my age, in the 80s it was very popular to use hackamores in show jumping. But it was interesting because they used to say, oh, you have to move them up and down the horse's face because they start to ignore them. And basically what they're saying is they habituated to the pressure of them because they didn't know how to release the pressure correctly. I thought this might show it, but it doesn't really. We do see in horses that are ridden with tight nosebands on can sometimes show, and sometimes horses without tight nosebands on, but we can sometimes see excessive salivation, and that can be caused by the fact that the horse can't really close its mouth properly with the really big bits and lots of pressure, and it just can, but also the compression of the parotid gland up here, which means that the horse can't swallow. That definitely tight nosebands can have an adverse effect on the ability that the horse has to breathe, and that's been shown scientifically. And when the horse is ridden in this very heavy, this outline, then he can't swallow. So copper rings, it's just a whole, Paloma. It's all to do, like, it's sort of like the emperor's new clothes. Everybody's got their thing that they love, and here we have something like this with rings on it. They're supposed to be something to give the horse something to play with his mouth. So that's the copper, because they're supposed to taste better. Same as this, we have all these different alloys that bits are made of, and this is one of them. That's some sort of copper thing as well, and that's what that's for. Interestingly enough, if you have horses with breathing problems, it can be really useful to use a bitless bridle on them, because there is something about the vacuum seal that is made in the horse's closed mouth that assists in breathing. So, for instance, at home, when we have horses that we've had one just recently that had melanomas in its throat, and it was just basically running out the end of its career. In a bit, it made a really loud breathing sound, and in a bitless bridle, it was able to breathe a lot better, and well, a lot less audibly. In the end, of course, you know, these things get to the point where they're not sustainable anymore, and that's what happened there. But it certainly, for a period of 2 years, the bit riding without the bit allowed the horse to continue to be used in a nice way, rather than having to retire him immediately. And that's something that I think would be a really interesting research project for someone, just to have a look at the difference in the breathing of a horse with a bit in its mouth and without a bit in its mouth. Which is not to say that in any way I don't advocate bit use. It's interesting to understand how these things work. Has anybody else got any questions?
I've got another one.
Sure.
What do you recommend to use for a horse if you have a horse that from previous riding has got like a really hard mouth, to make, like, sort of try and make his mouth soft again?
Yeah. So when horses become habituated to the pressure of the bit, the expression used in the horse industry is a hard-mouthed horse. Now, what we have to remember is that there are no physical changes to the horse's mouth when a horse is considered to be hard-mouthed. The changes are neurological, so that's just a pressure thing. They've just habituated to pressure. So we would always use something very simple like this, and basically what we have to do is not to use a bit. It doesn't really matter what bit you use, but the horse must be trained to understand that he can remove pressure. And so rather than change the bit and make the bit more aversive, we would change the training so that the horse became more sensitive to the pressure, so that we didn't put the horse under any, so that the horse was very, very calm in all the early training sessions, so that he learnt clearly how to remove the pressure. And then it doesn't really matter you know, what bit you use for that. It's all about responding to it. If we got really stuck, we would sensitise the horse to the pressure of the bit in the hand by using probably something like a whip taps on the front legs. So we would use that by reinstall that or sensitise it via classical conditioning. So we would say, we would teach the horse to go backwards from either tapping on the chest or tapping on his front legs with the whip. And then we would go light pressure of the bit, whip taps on the front legs, so he goes back. So he starts to predict that the whip taps will follow the bit pressure. And because the whip taps are a naive response, it's very good and very quick to get a very light response from it. And usually retraining a horse with a hard mouth or incorrect responses in the mouth is actually much more a matter of retraining the rider rather than the horse. So did that answer that question, Celine?
Yeah, definitely. That's cool. I've got one last one, is about the regular snaffle with the single joint.
Yes.
I think I've heard how that's probably if you pull a lot or something, but it can actually go up in the top of the mouth and point up there. Is that correct?
Yeah, they call it the nutcracker action. So if you think about it, if you pull on both the reins, that can happen. So that sharp pointy bit can go sort of into the horse's palate. And a lot of horses, particularly thoroughbred horses, have low palates, and therefore that pressure is aversive, which is why somewhere here I thought I had a snaffle with a double joint, and that doesn't have the nutcracker effect. No, I don't have one here. But that's a single jointed snaffle. Less likely to do the nutcracker for some reason because of the rings, but you can get different bits that what they call like a lock-up bit, doesn't bend too much. But yeah, that can work really well. Sorry, Natasha, I'll get to you now. Some of the lecture pictures, the horses had quite pale mucous membranes. Are the horses' mucous membranes generally quite pale, or is it due to the implement? That's a very good question. The colour of the horse's mucous membranes is really dependent on the colour of the horse, so they can change. So we always suggest to our students that they know what the colour of their horse's mucous membranes are. There is a very good video on YouTube going around, and if you Googled, I think it was Patrick Kittle, blue tongue, you would see where the horse's tongue has actually turned blue in its mouth because the circulation has been cut off to it. So although I don't think necessarily the mucous membranes get lighter in colour because of the bits, definitely the tongue can have the circulation compromised by excessive bit tightness. Yeah, and the tongue can go, suspect the tongue would go pale first and then eventually blue. So if someone wants to have a look, or if you're interested, you can look up, I think it's Patrick Kittle, Kittel, blue tongue, and it's a horse in a warm-up arena, and you can quite clearly see the tongue is blue, as though the horse is being, the circulation is being cut off. Does anybody else have any questions? So what is the difference between single and double joints in the snaffle to the horses? And I'm sorry I don't have a double jointed snaffle. Simply that when you have a double joint, instead of getting this effect, the bit is jointed here and here. So we get less of this poking effect of the bit in his mouth. So although this isn't a double jointed snaffle, you see how this one I can't make make a pokey bit in the middle. That's what happens with a double jointed snaffle. So the double jointed snaffle is considered more appropriate for things like dressage and stuff, because there's less likelihood that the bit where the snaffle joins together will poke into the top of the horse's mouth, because there's two joints in that. Did that answer your question? So the short answer to that is less nutcracker action when there's a single joint than when there's a joint. So you would see in most dressage horses nowadays, and probably show jumpers as well, would go in bits with two joints in the middle, because they're just, they tend to seem to go nicer in them. So that's probably the biggest change in horse tack equipment, basically one of the biggest changes in snaffle bit design for 3,000 years. And they're probably almost as many snaffles with 2 joints in the middle now as there are one. So that's quite a big change. Some horses chew on the bit, and why? And how do you change their behaviour? That's a really good question, Celine. It could be a multitude of things. Could be because obviously the horse has an incredibly sensitive mouth, because he, as I said before, is a discriminatory grazer. So they usually say that horses have about as much dexterity with their mouths as we would with a 4-fingered hand. So that's quite a lot. A lot of horses fiddle with the bits, or are difficult with the bits in their mouth because they are not light on the signals. In my experience, horses that learn to do things like put their tongues out to the side or get their tongues over the bit are generally those that do not have very clear training. So when we have a horse that's fussy in the mouth, we generally make sure that they are able to offer really light and immediate responses to the pressure cues of the reins. So that would be step number one, or actually step number one would be to make sure the horse hasn't got sharp teeth. Now, because horses have hypsodont teeth, they can grow sharp edges really quickly, and obviously not so much the bit, but nose bands can very much compress the sharp teeth against the gums. And definitely when the bit rides up in the horse's mouth, then it compresses the sharp teeth against the gums as well. And so we would make sure that the horse's teeth were really good, and that he was able to show really light responses to pressure. I think what happens when behaviours are learned, they sort of develop in the thalamus, and then they go to the amygdala. And when they go through the amygdala, it basically confers a degree of emotional significance to a behaviour. So which we call a conditioned emotional response. So if when the horse is initially introduced to the bit, he learns to become tense in its presence, because that's his first exposure to being ridden or to being trained, that's not done sensitively and slowly, then he can learn a conditioned emotional response because of classical conditioning that is maintained throughout his training career. So Joseph Ledoux, as we've already showed, demonstrated that fear responses in the horse are not subject to extinction. So if when the horse is in his early training, the horse shows a fear response related to the bit, that can cause him to constantly chew on the bit. It's an anxiety kind of thing as well. Then there are lots of other sorts of reasons why. People say that when horses are first ridden or whatever, they quite often stop chewing or licking or whatever, because they are using their sympathetic nervous system. So that's the flight or fight response. And then when they calm down, they start using their parasympathetic nervous system, which is your rest and digest. So when they start to do what basically are called post-inhibitory rebound behaviours, which means that they then start to do all the licking and the chewing that they didn't do when they were tense before. So there are lots and lots of different reasons why a horse might chew on the bit. And the other thing is that maybe the bit doesn't fit his mouth properly, and therefore it's uncomfortable. So that's a possibility too. Anybody else got any questions? Did that answer your question? Alison, what do you think about a loose ring compared to a fixed? Some horses like the stability of a fixed ring and some horses don't. So we would always start young horses in something like this, which is just plain, it's got sides on it. I don't particularly like the big bits that they use for breaking in, but I find that this just makes the bit slightly more stable in their mouth than, say, a loose ring snaffle, which has a lot more movement in it. But some horses, particularly those that have been trained well, really like, oh, good on you, Dave, that really like the the sort of mobility of the loose ring snaffle. So I think it's completely, Alison, a matter for personal preference, except that if you're putting like a young child on a young horse, I would always go with something with sides, because then they can't pull the bit through the horse's mouth. So Dave, if I just click on this, will it show it now?
Yep, I think so.
Can everybody see that? Am I sharing that, or is that just on my computer now?
You might need to share your screen rather than the slides.
Oh, Dave, now you're talking. Okay, hang on. All right. How do I do that, Dave?
So where you had the share slides,
Yep. Okay, yep.
there's a share screen as well.
Oh, you're so clever. There you go. Oh. No, that's not the one.
You might have to stop your slides first.
Okay, okay. So let's unshare the slides. Okay, now I'm going to go back here, share screen, and if I share that, it doesn't want me to do it. Okay, application window. No.
I might be able to do it from mine.
Oh yeah, well, oh, here we go. I got it. I got it.
Got it?
There you go. All right. Well, it would be good if I could play it. See his tongue? No, Brianna, it doesn't. Shamefully, it doesn't get penalised in competitions. That did cause a great big uproar, that particular video, but it didn't stop him from being asked to, and it was a bit controversial because not long after that video, he was the imported expert at Equitana, Patrick Kittle, and people were kind of horrified that someone that had been busted doing that. But no, there are no stewards in warm-up arenas. You can pretty much do anything you want in a warm-up arena. And I think that horse is a show jumper, and you can put anything in a show jumper's mouth, like literally anything, as long as they don't bleed. And there's no rules on it in actual show jumping, whereas in dressage and eventing, there are much more complicated rules for different bits that are allowed, but show jumping, not so much. Same as endurance, I think you can put pretty much anything in the horse's mouth for endurance. But yeah, there you go. Any other questions? Thanks for finding that, Dave. Great video, isn't it?
No problem.
Paloma, yes, in show jumping, unless there's blood, in which case you get eliminated. In dressage, if the horse shows obvious distress in the mouth, then you get penalised for that. If the horse is opening its mouth, you get penalised from that. But it's certainly in modern dressage right at this moment, you don't get your noseband tightness checked. So it's a really interesting thing. In dressage, they privilege the contact of the bit to the rein. We want to see the horse have a nice even contact on the bit, but it's okay to put a noseband on and crank it so tight that the horse can't open its mouth. So it's a really ridiculous situation. But yes, unless there's blood, and in all equestrian sports, there's a blood rule. If there's any blood on the horse anywhere, then you're eliminated. which happened quite recently with Charlotte Desjardins, who rides for England very successfully. It's best rider in England, tried to cut a horse with a spur in the warm-up and was penalised, obviously, for that. She was disqualified, and obviously she couldn't continue in the competition. And there was a lot of uproar about it, like, oh, that was nothing, it wasn't much blood. At the end of the day, if you've cut the horse, you've cut the horse. And that's the blood rule, and out you go. Any other questions? Right. Have you got anything to add, Dave or Julia?
Just to, oh, hang on, sorry. Just to tell you that the exam format for the final exam for this year, we're just working through the timetabling, people. There is a draft exam timetable out at the moment, so as soon as we know the actual date of the exam, we'll let you know. We'll let you know for the reason that this is going to be an online final exam, and the way we're going to set it up this year is a slightly different format to previous exams, obviously due to COVID-19 and having to put things online. We're going to have a format where it's mainly short essay type questions, and there'll be questions that you'll need to integrate a lot of the information maybe from different lectures. Because it has to be an open book exam, we've got to get you guys thinking a little bit more, so you can't just flick through your lecture notes and come up with the answers to the questions. So you'll have to use some of your knowledge from different lectures and integrate it together to answer the questions. So there'll be a number of short essay type questions, and the format is that the length of the exam will be the same, so it'll be about a 2-hour exam, but you'll have a 23-hour window to hand that exam in. So actually you've got 23 hours to do the exam, and it's open book. So is there any questions about that? I'll send out more information on that once I know more myself, and we might even put up some practice questions as well.
Yes, any other questions? Oh, Natasha said, you feel like the horse is due to low oxygen. Yeah, I think that's because the bit is cutting off the circulation in its tongue, or its head is so close to its neck that it can't breathe properly. So yeah, for sure. It says here, Dave, the timetable says the 19th.
Yeah, so hopefully that won't change, but it may change.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anyone else got anything to add or say? Have you got anything to add, Julia? She's probably watching YouTube videos on her phone. Yes, Natasha, the old exams will help for preparation for sure, but you would want to sort of acknowledge to yourself that there'll be none of those sort of easy one, short answers. It's almost all going to be all short, like essays, and you're going to have to show a lot more sort of applied knowledge. That's right, isn't it, Dave?
That's right.
Yeah, Julia, I know, you were watching YouTube. Okay, any more questions? All right. Well, if that's no one's got any questions, I will see you all tomorrow for a lecture on stereotypies. Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Portland.
Oh, that's my pleasure, Dave. I'm just sad that the guys didn't get to do a prac like we normally do.
I know, I was looking forward to leading them around with the reins.
I know. And watching them put the bits in their mouth.
Yes, yeah.
I know. Anyway, next year, hopefully.
Yep, fingers crossed.
Yeah, it would have been fun, Natasha. You don't have to do it. It's always voluntary. All right. Anyway, if nobody's got any more questions, I'll see you tomorrow at 10:30. So I'm going to do stereotypies, and then I'm going to do the elephant training one, Dave.
Okay, great.
Is that that's on the schedule?
Yep.
All right. Well, we'll see you all tomorrow then. See you, Dave.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.
See you, Julia.